Alrighty, folks, it is June, and if you have been paying attention to the news, there's a lot of craziness going on in the world, and the people have spoken, justice has been served, a decision has been made, the bad man is going away, and he can't hurt us anymore. Angel Hernandez is no longer an MLB umpire.
Yes. Sports bettors rejoice all around. Angel Hernandez. Right? I didn't think that's where you were going. I was a little nervous. I'm not going to lie. I tensed up. Can you imagine how many lines for sports betting that Angel Hernandez has negatively affected because he just plainly could not see? But baseball is in a better place, and I'm happy for it. I don't know how you feel.
Yeah, I think it's definitely in a good place, and I'm really just trying to force a metaphor into the introduction of this episode, because the thing about Angel Hernandez is he made a lot of bad decisions that people didn't like. And like it or not, policy and procedure requirements are back on the menu for NIST SP 800-171 Revision 3, which means they are inevitably back on the menu for CMMC once it's updated to reference Revision 3 of 800-171 requirements. And policies and procedures ultimately come down to the decisions that you make as senior leadership, as management, as a company. So today we are going to do a deep dive into documenting management decisions as policies and procedures. Yes, Jason, question?
So, not a question. I just want to make sure. This isn't the McRib. It doesn't disappear, come back, disappear, come back. This is policies and procedures. You said it went off the menu and then it came back on the menu. I'm confused because if you've read NIST 800-171 in its present form, how can you say that policies and procedures were never on the menu, Jacob?
Yeah, well, so policies and procedures are less like the McRib being on the menu and then not on the menu and then on the menu again, mostly as a way to manipulate the pork market. Longer story, different podcast. It's more like the secret menu at In-N-Out, where they were there the whole time. You just didn't know that you needed to ask for them. But they are actually there under the surface. I'm out of fast food metaphors, so let's just jump right into it, okay? Okay, so first things first, 3 big things to know about NIST policies and procedures just to set the stage here. 1, policy in the NIST world as defined in the NIST philosophy going back all the way to 1995 and NIST Special Publication 812, the Introduction to Computer Security, the NIST handbook, almost 30 years ago. They describe policy, they define policy as the documentation of senior management's security decisions. Policies document your decision as a management team about the security of your environment, right? That's ultimately what policies are designed to represent. The second thing to know, security controls, all of the controls in the 853 catalog that you could possibly select from and tailor to create a baseline for whatever your environment is, are designed to enforce policy as management decisions. So you make decisions about what needs to happen. Controls are selected and tailored, implemented, verified, and monitored on and on and on in order to enforce your management decision. So you are selecting and implementing controls in accordance with your policy decisions as a management team. They are not separate things. The last thing to know is the -1 controls, as they are referred to. So AC-1, AT-1, SA-1, the first control in each of the control families of 853 are the quote-unquote policy and procedure controls. Every family has a -1 control, policy and procedure control, and they are identical with the exception of which family they're referring to. They all have, as of 853 Rev 5, 3 control items, in total 9 multi-part lines in 853. In 853A, the verification procedures for those policy controls, there are 7 organizationally defined parameters. They actually list 8, but one of them is a duplicate. So there's 7 organizationally defined parameters, and there are 17 corresponding determination statements for each of the -1 controls for each of the control families in 853. They are all the same. Interesting note, the numbering for the 853 controls, the number corresponds to when those controls were inserted into the catalog. So AC 53 would have been the 53rd access control that was put into the catalog. AU4 would have been the 4th auditing control inserted into the catalog. So the bigger the number, the more recent those controls were made. The smaller the number, the older the controls are, which means that the very first controls that NIST ever inserted into the catalog in the big bang of NIST controls were policies and procedures, because the ultimate underlying philosophy of NIST controls is that you are selecting and implementing controls to enforce policy that documents management decisions. This is a very top-down way of looking at it. That is in contrast to what happens a lot of the time in the real world, where we are just sort of allowing people to spend money and select controls and devices and decide what needs to happen, almost completely disconnected from policy, if there even is documented policy, which means that there really isn't any sort of formalized management decision that's being enforced. And from the perspective of small businesses, it's very interesting, because if people are spending money on your control environment and it isn't in line with what you want, what are they spending your money on? And so this isn't just, purely theory here as far as what NIST is saying in terms of how their policy philosophy plays out in the control catalog. There's some real world value here from understanding that perspective and applying it to your own control environment.
Very rare in the div space do we see that kind of thought process carried out from the perspective of the OSA. I can tell you from my consulting experience, a lot of times somebody has been brought in to serve in a position, and in that position it's because of their experience carrying out whatever mission, doing whatever they were doing before, right? And there is no policy dictating it. This person comes in and they have their own sleigh of tools that they want to dish out. We're comfortable using this. You got to throw this in place, and there is nothing that dictates it. Where that makes things difficult is when you are discussing as a person that's trying to provide consulting advice, and you're saying you need this tool, and that person is opposed to it, and there's no policy from the company that dictates this is how we carry things out. That's where you hit a hiccup, and that's where the progress stops, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's just the sort of high level idea of NIST's approach to policy controls in relation to the overall control catalog. This goes all the way back to the primordial proto NIST documents pre-FSMA. I mean, this permeates all of the original NIST documents from the NIST SP 800 single digit documents. If you want to go on a trip back through time and read 30-year-old NIST standards, highly recommended. Anyways, so we're going to talk about what 853 says specifically about policy and procedure controls and the 853A verification procedures for a couple of reasons. One, they are not a perfect template, but they are a very good, decent outline over what the shell of a policy needs to include. And because most people, whether it's through NIST controls or CMMC or this or that, are going to be forced to document decisions as policy, you're probably going to end up buying templates or trying to find free templates online. And this is a good way to check to make sure that you aren't getting ripped off, or that you aren't sort of deluding yourself into thinking that your policies will make it through an assessment, because the NIST controls in 853 and 53A tell you what a decent policy outline needs to look like. As far as CMMC and 800-171 goes, any amount of policy requirements that are derived from those 853 controls will always be satisfied if you know what the overall 853 set of items will say, right? And ultimately, one of the reasons why we're starting to do this deep dive to kick off a long series of deep dives into many other topics is with this 853 revision, they're adding things back into the baseline with this 800-171 revision, they're adding things back into the baseline from 853 that they originally took out. And everybody keeps talking about how much time it's going to take to train people and to update the materials and to get everything caught up. And I think that's bullshit, because you are going to need to catch up to things that were already there in 853. It is the reference material from which this stuff was derived. And as we'll talk about at the end, this was the original set of requirements in CMMC 1.0 now 4 or 5 years ago. So there's no reason why we need to just sort of wait until everything gets updated in rulemaking to know what a decent policy looks like.
So I'm still blown away. I'm a bit taken back, because the understanding of, I make this argument all the time, Jacob. When we developed the CMMC 1.0, or when we developed, like I was a part of it, that's that we, when you're a fan
this
of
is
the
your
NFL
fault.
Team, they, us, whatever. No, but when CMMC 1.0 was developed, it exceeded some of the requirements in which were found in 800-171, right? That were found blatantly as controls. Now we know that policies and procedures were in there, and they're that nasty 3-letter word that we don't want to talk about. I've never been in a position where there hasn't been policies and procedures in place to dictate things. If you read 800-171, there's no way that you have properly implemented NIST 800-171 without policies and procedures in place. Are you still tracking there?
Yeah, and this is why, and we'll talk about some of the assumptions that NIST made later on, but this is why NIST made assumptions in the creation of 800-171. Was they said, well, if you're implementing all these requirements, if you're implementing these controls, well, of course they're being implemented in accordance with your policy, because if you didn't make decisions, why are you spending any money on things? Like, how did you decide what to implement and what to configure and why and how? And how are you spending resources and time on these things if you didn't think about the decision that's driving them? It couldn't possibly be the case that people are just sort of flailing around and splashing in the water, guessing what they need to spend their money on and what they need to implement and what they need to configure. That would be ridiculous. As it turns out, that's actually what happens most of the time, which is why they had to revise their assumptions and change what's in the baseline with 171 Rev 3.
We implemented blank because we hired this person, and this person has experience with blank. Right. That is what it comes down to most times.
Very common. So, all right. So let's talk about what 853 says about the outline of a decent policy and procedure control, in the sense that we can sort of see what a template would start to look like. So a generic XX-1 policy and procedure control, for those of you who want to follow at home, just pick any of the -1 controls in 853 and it'll show you what we're talking about. It'll start out and say that you need to develop, document, and disseminate to an ODP here, organization-defined personnel or roles. So 2 things. You need to develop, document, and disseminate to a group of people 2 things. The first is a organization, mission, process, or system level policy that does a few things, and procedures that facilitate the implementation of the policy and associated controls. So we are developing, documenting, and disseminating to a group of people whom we are going to define a policy and a procedure. That policy is going to occur at a certain level, the organization level, a mission or business process level, a specific system level, and then the corresponding procedures to implement that policy and the associated controls, right? The associated controls for implementing that policy. Now, some details on the first part, the nature of this policy. They say that the policy is going to need to address purpose, scope, roles, responsibilities, management commitment, coordination among organizational entities, and compliance with the policy, as well as the policy is consistent with applicable laws, executive orders, directives, regulations, policies, standards, and guidelines. These are external forces on the organization that may drive the nature of internal policy decisions, right? You may have external requirements that will say you have to retain data for a certain period of time, or you have to report incidents within a certain period of time, or whatever they might happen to be. So that's the first part of what they say a policy is going to look like. And we can already start to see the shape forming here of what needs to be included in a policy. It has to be disseminated to people. It has to have corresponding procedures and controls that implement it. It has to have scope. It has to be informed of any external requirements. So we can start to see already that if your templates that you're finding or that you're buying don't include elements like that, it's probably not going to be something that's going to work out in the long run. So there's a couple of other items that they outline here for a solid policy. They say that you need to designate, here's another ODP, you need to designate an organizational defined official to manage the development, documentation, and dissemination of the policies and procedures. Someone needs to be in charge of this thing, right? Who's responsible for developing the policy, for maintaining the policy, for making sure people are informed about the policy, for reviewing it, for updating it? Whose job is this, right? Who do I talk to ask questions about this policy? If I'm an assessor, if you're an internal assessor, if you're just someone in the company that's interested, or the business owner that wants to know what the heck is going on, whose job is it? Who do I talk to? Who owns this problem, right? So it's a pretty reasonable question to ask.
So a reasonable question to ask on top of that is that the same person that signs it?
It could be. It could be. So it depends on the size of the organization. In some larger organizations, there's probably a lot of delegated responsibility. The point is you have to assign this to somebody. So, where management endorsement of the policy falls, where responsibility for maintaining it or reviewing it or updating it falls can vary depending on really the size and governance structure of an organization. For most smaller organizations, it might be the same person. But the line between the person who's ultimately on the hook for signing the policy as like the company owner and the person who's in charge of whatever might not be all that big. So it just depends on the size. I don't want to say that they will always be the same person, because once a company gets to even maybe a couple dozen employees, it's probably not the same person.
Sure.
Okay, and so then the last part of what NIST outlines in a dash, this is just the -1 control text, essentially. They say that you need to review and update the policy and procedures. And then we have a couple of ODPs here. So you need to review and update the current policy at an organization-defined frequency and following organizational-defined events. Same thing for the procedures. At some organization-defined frequency and after some organization-defined type of event, you have to review and update these procedures. So in total, we've got a bunch of ODPs, and we've got a bunch of multi-part lines in these various control items. So if you look in 853A, luckily in Rev 5, they show you right at the top how many ODPs there are. They have a list of 8 ODPs. Like we said before, the first 2 are duplicative, so there's really only 7. Great news. So we need to be able to define the personnel or roles to whom the policy is going to be disseminated. We're making a decision about what these people can and can't do. We're informing them of what they can and can't do. So who's getting the policy? Like, who's being made aware of this policy? We also need to update one or more of the following to say this is an organizational level policy, this is a business unit policy, this is a system level policy for just this one system that we have. It just depends on what the situation is. We also need to have an official to manage the policy and the procedures that are defined in this control. The frequency at which the policy is reviewed and updated, and the events that would trigger a review and update. The same thing goes for the procedure, the frequency and the events that would trigger. So these are the things that we need to define to flesh out the rest of this control. Now, if you read the 853 control, it seems pretty straightforward. But you notice that in the first part, they talk about, well, the policy needs to address a bunch of different things. It needs to address scope, roles, responsibilities, blah, 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 blah. It needs to do this, it needs to do this, it needs to do this, it needs to do all these things. Well, they have just commas everywhere, and they're just saying list of things. It needs to do this and this and this and this and this. So in our mind, we can imagine that at 853A, there's probably going to be multiple determination statements for each one of those combinations of things on one line, which is why you have 9 things in the control, but you've got 17 determination statements in 853A to make sure you did all the stuff listed in those 9 things, right?
Yeah, and then for a majority of these things that are listed in the ODPs, you'll find them in most policies either in appendixes or in introductory parts to the document, right? It's just laying out the lay of the land. This is for this. This is what it's for. This is what it covers. And this is what it and basically entitles what we do, what our company policy is.
Yeah.
So when you get into the controls is when people start thinking, oh, well, this is where it gets more complicated.
And to be fair, the formatting of the controls, and especially the formatting of the verification procedures in 853A, isn't very easy to look at. The way that they identify the ODPs is very cryptic. But what we're going to do right now is we're going to go back. We're going to walk through each of those lines from the 853 control, and we're going to talk about the corresponding verification procedure that matches it in 853A, which is why I always ask NIST, can you please combine these two documents for the sake of our sanity, so we don't have to constantly flip back and forth between the two of them? Tell me what the line is in the control, and then tell me how to verify it. Tell me what the line is in the control, and then tell me how to verify it. But we got to be the change we want to see in the world. So we're starting at the top with policy and procedure controls. So here we go. The first part of the 853 control says, develop, document, and disseminate to an organization-defined set of personnel or roles. This is ODP 1, as they refer to it. I need to define the personnel that I'm disseminating the policy to. So then in 853A, this is actually split into two different parts. They say an access control, or any control policy. I just use access control as an example. A policy is developed and documented. So the original line said develop, document, and disseminate. Here it says develop and document. Yes, you have developed and documented a policy. If you haven't developed and documented the policy, there's no reason to ask the rest of the questions because the policy doesn't exist. Assuming that you have developed and documented this policy, have you disseminated it to the group of people that you defined, right? This is why they asked you to define it at the beginning. Who's supposed to be getting this policy? You've developed it, you've documented it, you know who's supposed to get it. Did they get it? Yes, good. Okay, the first part of the control is done, right? This is why you have this sort of breakdown of multiple determination statements that can stem from a single line in a control, because there's multiple steps to verify that that multi-part line has been implemented, but nothing too crazy so far. So then when we go into the first subpart here, they say we need to select a level for this policy. It's an organizational level policy, it's a business unit policy, it's a system level policy. This is what they refer to as ODP number 3. What level of policy? What's the scope of this policy for the organization? This is a pretty common ingredient in a lot of policy templates, but just be aware that your policy needs to have a scope to it. What is this for? Like, you've developed it, you've documented it, you've given out to people. When they first read it, they go, I don't know, am I in scope for this? Like, what does this mean? Okay. Under there, they say that it needs to address purpose, scope, roles, responsibilities, management, commitment, coordination among entities, and compliance with the policy. And this is where a bunch of the determination statements start to accumulate, because each one of those things is considered to be its own determination statement. And they'll say, with ODP number 3, the level of policy, it addresses purpose. Let's say, for example, we're doing an organizational level policy for access control. And it'll say your organizational level access control policy addresses the purpose of the policy, the scope of the policy, the roles, the responsibilities, the management commitment to this policy, coordination among any organizational entities that are required in accordance with this policy, and compliance with this policy. What happens if I don't do it? What happens, are there any consequences to what's going on? It's sort of a just vanilla overall shell of what the purpose of a policy is supposed to do in accordance with the scope of the policy that we defined in ODP 3, organization, business unit, system level, right? I have a policy for access to this one system, like, I don't know, the engineering database that has all of our IP in it, right? Only certain people are allowed to have access to this system for whatever reason. Very narrow scope, very limited set of roles and responsibilities, very limited in terms of who's in charge of this policy, very significant penalties for non-compliance with this policy, so on and so forth. So you can see how this would expand and contract based off of the level or scope of the policy that you set in one of those ODPs. Okay, moving on. They also say that this policy needs to be consistent with applicable laws, executive orders, directives, regulations, policies, standards, and guidelines. So our organization level access control policy is consistent with these external requirements. Now, this is a bit of a This is a bit of a tricky situation because when your CMMC assessors show up, they may not know all of your external requirements that drive some of your internal metrics or some of your internal requirements that are reflected in this policy. They may not know that you've got a customer that has imposed these external requirements on you. They do know about some of your external requirements specific to DFARS clauses, specific to ODPs that the DoD might define for all DoD contractors, specific to CMMC specific guidance, things like that. These are external laws and regulations that affect your internal decisions as documented in your policy. But this is one reason why they're not called audits, because we don't necessarily know what the answer needs to be for these things. You're supposed to know that. They're your customers. It's your company subject to these external regulations. This is why when the Department of Justice starts asking questions, they want to ask about your policy documentation, because you, the business owner, made the executive decision to do or do not do certain things, and you knew about your external regulatory obligations, which is why a big part of this control says that this policy is consistent with those external regulations. Just as a quick aside, this is a reason why, or an example of a reason why, NIST doesn't specify things very much inside of their controls, because imagine they're writing this for an audience that could be used in essentially any environment, any size, any context, federal, non-federal, regulated, unregulated. They don't know who's picking up this standard. And so they aren't going to fill in the blanks and say this law, this standard, this regulation, or this, because then it's only applicable for that specific set of companies with that specific set of requirements. This is why it's a toolbox of controls that you need to fill all the blanks in during the tailoring process, because your specific context is your specific context. Okay. So then when they get to the procedures to facilitate the implementation of the organization level access control policy and associated controls, 853A says the access control procedures to facilitate the implementation of the policy and associated controls are developed and documented, right? Which is why one of the things that they reference as a resource for verifying your policies and procedures is your system security plan. Because where would we document the implementation and description of our control environment? We're going to do that in our SSP. And our SSP is outlining all these controls that we selected and tailored in accordance with our management decisions as documented by policy. And on we go through the circle of life of selection and tailoring and implementation of NIST security controls. 853A goes on to say that the access control procedures are disseminated to the set of personnel or roles that we defined in ODP 1, right? So it's right back up and referencing some of those ODPs that we defined at the top. Okay, moving on to the second control item in the policy, you have to designate an organization-defined official to manage the development, documentation, and dissemination of this access control, organization-level access control policy and corresponding procedures. This is ODP number 4. We have to define who this person is. Who are we actually assigning this responsibility to? And in 853A, they say ODP 4 official, whoever that is designated to manage the development, documentation, and dissemination of the control and procedures, right? So the control says, do this. The verification procedure asks, did you do this? So if you haven't defined who that person is, but you say, yes, we have done this, the first question I have is, who did you designate to do this thing? And if you say Bob over there, and I go, hey, Bob, are you the access control, organization level access control designated person with that responsibility? Is what are you talking about? I'll go, whoa, boy. I don't know if that's actually a true story, right? Whose job is it to maintain this thing? It's kind of odd that that would not be the very first thing at the top, but it's just one of the quirky things that goes with NIST controls. And just a reminder, this is exactly the same for every single control family. These are the exact same items, exact same verification procedures for 853 and 53A in every control family. Okay, so last part here, review and update the current policies and procedures. So for the policy, for the corresponding procedures, there's going to be an organization-defined frequency. every month, every week, every year, every decade. Who knows?
Periodically.
Periodically, there's going to be some time period in which you routinely update and review these policies and procedures. In addition to that, there could be certain events that would trigger the review and updating of policies. Something bad happens, something good happens, major change happens. Who knows, whatever it is. There needs to be some type of event after which, I mean, you don't just define it and then you only look at it once a year. What happens if there's something involved with the system that this policy is involved with? What happens if there's a major change or upgrade or tech refresh or who knows what, right? If there's a major change in management and they're the ones that signed the policy, it might not be time to review the policy, but that might trigger a review of the policy, right? So you have 4 different ODPs just in this one section, but it's not really all that complicated as to when you would do this or why you might do this.
So this is a really common ODP that we see up here, not only in 172, but 171, which is 171 Rev 3, which is updating something in the periodic frequency or at specific events, right? Like you just said. And then in 172, when we saw the CMMC level 3 stuff and the DoD defined the ODPs in that, the frequency was major event changes or security incident, right? That's when they want you to do these things. And it's just basically depending on the purpose of the controls when that comes into play.
Yeah. Yeah. Now there's a lot of ODPs here, and these are universal across all control families. One of the rare examples of this being universal across all control families. There's a bunch of them. So this gets to the question of what should they be? And there is only certain examples of ODPs being defined that we can draw from. And there's 2 examples for these controls. One comes from the FedRAMP baseline, because FedRAMP is the program that verifies that you've implemented 853 controls in a certain environment for cloud offerings. The other one is a document known as CNSSI 1253, which is a document that contains a bunch of information about national security systems, but under the hood, it's all 853 controls, right? And so we can look at both of those documents, look at any of the -1 controls and say, did they define any of the ODPs, and can we use that as a reference point? And as it turns out, they did. Now, they didn't define who the person needs to be who is in charge of the policy, because it's a different context for everybody. They didn't define who needs to have the policy disseminated to them, because it's a different context for everybody. But they did say the amount of time that needs to go by in terms of your reviewing the policies and procedures is at least annually. They both say that. They say at least annually you need to review these policies and procedures. Now, FedRAMP goes on to say, well, what about the events that would trigger a review of a policy? And they say one of 2 things, at least annually and after any significant change to the things inside the scope of this policy, which is exactly what you just said. So these are just kind of generic examples, but probably the right answer for 99.9% of companies out there. When you have a policy that says we need to do X, just make sure that you review it annually, and you have a line that says we're also going to review this if there's ever a significant change pertinent to this policy. And that's it.
Or
that's it.
Let's say that you're using on-prem servers and all of a sudden the organization does away with the on-prem servers. You can have a policy on how you protect your on-prem services when you no longer have them, right? I mean, you can, but you can't say that that's how you satisfy.
Well, if an assessor shows up and you say, yeah, we're good to go, like, we have our governance, in lockstep with what's going on with our operations, and then you whip out a policy that's referencing systems that no longer exist in your control environment, they're gonna be like, are you sure that you updated this 6 months ago? Because you don't even have these systems anymore, and this person doesn't even work here.
Yeah.
So yeah, you definitely want to make sure. That's why they reference that there are procedures for maintaining these policies, not just policy written in stone and then forgotten about on a shelf somewhere. And that's really all there is to the NIST approach to policies and procedures. Those controls are the same structure, same format, same ODPs, same things in every control family. So if you are looking for free templates online, which can be pretty dicey, or you're looking to spend money on policy and procedure templates, which can be pretty expensive depending on who you go with, make sure that they at least have all of those items in 853A that correspond to each of the lines an 853, and you're probably going to be good to go. Because when we shift gears and we start talking about SP 800-171 and CMMC, we know that everything in those environments is a smaller version of what's in 853. So if all of our policies match what's in 853, they will automatically subsume what's going on in the fewer lines going on in SP 800-171 that are evaluated by CMMC. Okay, so to get to a little bit of a snafu here, right? A little bit of a snag in what's going on. In SP 800-171 Rev 2, policy and procedures are not required. Because if you go down to the tailoring criteria in one of the appendices, they'll say the -1 control in every family is NFO. And an NFO control has been tailored out of the baseline because NIST says we expect that these controls will be routinely satisfied without specification. We are not specifying that this is a requirement because we assume that you will be doing this routinely. And that is a huge problem because we just talked about, not that long ago at the top of the episode, the fundamental idea, the fundamental philosophy permeating NIST controls for 30 years has been you are selecting controls and implementing them to enforce policy. And so if you don't have any policy, what is the control environment doing? I've actually seen Victoria Piliteri have the gears in her brain stop on stage because she's like, how is that possible? How is it possible that you've done this thing? What have you spent your money on? Why did you do any of the things that you did if you didn't have a decision that you made about it? Now, that's debatable as to whether that's a realistic view of the world, but that's just sort of what's going on. It was so fundamental to their worldview of how things work. They just assumed they didn't need to tell people to have policies. And this is going to be a problem because a lot of the things that are going to be implemented and defined and specified and documented for all of the corresponding associated controls in that control family are going to be documented in the policy and procedures from the -1 control. So when you look through 800-171A, and it says define this, specify this, document this, define this, specify this, document this, where did you do that? And so if you don't have it documented in your policies and procedures, you can't verify the determination statements in 171A, which means you can't get an SPRS score, which means you can't get a CMMC certification. You have to have the documentation in order to do the thing, in order to get the stuff, in order for DoD to leave you alone so you can go about your business. Okay, when we get to SP 800-171 Revision 3, those -1 controls are no longer categorized as NFO. They're tailored back into the baseline, and now they are considered to be relevant because, as we've talked about with Ron Ross before, they found out that the NFO control assumptions were not valid assumptions, and they have since reversed them. Good on you, NIST. That was the right decision. So in SP 800-171 Revision 3, Requirement 3.15.1, Policies and Procedures, you may notice something very strange. There are only 2 control items, not 9, and there's only one ODP, not 7. And it only says develop, document, and disseminate to organizational personnel or roles policies and procedures needed to satisfy the security requirements for the protection of CUI. It doesn't say that you need an access control policy. It doesn't say that you need an auditing and logging policy. It doesn't say that you need a physical security policy. It doesn't say that you need a risk assessment policy. It doesn't say that you need a system and services acquisition policy. It doesn't say that you need a policy for each of the control families. It just says have policy for the things involving CUI. Is that helpful? It's more helpful than saying we just assume you're going to have policy, but it kind of blurs the fact that you're going to need to have some specific policies for some specific stuff that's going to extend beyond just a single requirement. You can see in 800-171 Rev 3 that they merged all of the -1 controls and they said just have policy. That is an improvement over Rev 2, but it isn't exactly truthful for the amount of documentation that you're going to need.
Yeah, because the questions were always, well, how many policies do I need? Do I need 14, one for each domain? Do I need one for this, one for that, one for this? And then everybody has policy that covers different things. And so what you would see is, especially in the smaller businesses, is that it would be combined into one overall guidance document that was designed by the organization that dictated everything, that had different books, almost like, and I am not, this is probably terrible for me to reference, but maybe like I was going to say the Bible, but it would be awful.
Okay, yeah, we can go there. Yeah,
I just don't know exactly how it works, but basically, overall, it's the Bible, right? And then there's different books of the Bible. Am I correct?
Sure. Yeah.
All right. So correct me if I'm wrong here. Like, this isn't my area of expertise.
I think I'm picking up what you're.
But essentially, it's your cybersecurity or your Bible, right? Your organizational Bible, and then each individual book, the Book of Access Control, the Book of Auditing and Accountability, right? Written.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm probably going to get crucified for this, and this is enough religious references.
Good pun. Good pun. Okay, so when we talk about what's actually in 171, the only other control item is review and update policies and procedures with an organization defined frequency. Sounds very familiar, right? But they obviously cut a lot of stuff out. We're going to get to that in a second. When you look at 171A, just like 53A, there are multiple determination statements for the control items in 171 because you have to break these down. You have to decompose them into what needs to be verified. So here we only have 6 determination statements because what NIST actually decided was that in that -1 control, a bunch of stuff is not NFO, but NCO, not directly related to protecting the confidentiality of CUI. Now, riddle me this, everyone. We're going to put on our thinking caps at home. The fundamental idea behind NIST security control philosophy is that everything starts with management decision that is documented in policy and procedure, and then that drives the selection and tailoring, implementation, verification, and continuous monitoring of your control environment in order to enforce that management decision. And so we have an outline of what a solid management decision document looks like, but the part about the policy that addresses purpose, scope, roles, responsibilities, management commitment to the policy, coordination among organizational entities, and compliance with the policy, and the idea that the policy would be consistent with applicable laws, executive orders, directives, regulations, policies, standards, and guidelines, and designating somebody to be in charge of the management, development, documentation, and dissemination of those policies and procedures is not relevant. Like, what? The fundamental core of the document documenting management decision is not relevant to protecting the confidentiality of CUI, even though the corresponding controls that are designed to enforce that management decision are relevant to protecting the confidentiality of CUI. And we didn't press Dr. Ross very hard on this question, but I think it's kind of obvious that they trimmed these pieces away from the policy in order to keep 171 Rev 3 arbitrarily small, because you can't trim the fundamental essence of the documentation of management decision from the policy if the controls in your environment are supposed to be enforcing the management decision documented in the policy, right? It just doesn't make any sense. You're putting the cart in front of the horse and you end up with exactly the same problem. So my recommendation, I think a reasonable recommendation, is structure your policy, whether you're generating it in ChatGPT or you're buying templates from somebody online or who knows what, against the template in 853 rather than the template in 171, because they're missing a bunch of stuff, and it will make it way, way easier for your assessor to see what they're verifying in the rest of the controls with a full 853 version of a policy rather than a weird, cut down, mutated excuse for a policy that shows up in 171. Okay. So, yes, Jason.
I was going to triple stamp your double stamp. I agree with you. I mean, I think that we've spoke to exhaustion on this show the importance of understanding the absolute root of the control that you are implementing based on the meaning of it in 53, where it comes from in 53, its origin there. And so when you do the policy, the thing that's going to dictate everything, the procedures, whatever that goes along with it, I think that is the great place to start from the root, especially when it's the policy and procedure control that's associated with it.
Yeah, I think it's just like asking yourself, be like, is this a good policy? I'll be like, it doesn't describe what the purpose is. Be like, that's a bad policy. be like, is this policy effective? It'd be like, well, nobody's in charge of doing anything with it, updating it, or telling anybody about it. It's probably not very effective. And so when those two things are removed from 853 for the sake of making 800-171 a certain size, it's probably better to go with the 853 version and just playing it safe so you don't have to update it in the future, because this has literally been the way that NIST describes policies as an outline of what they look like for 30 years. So I would just go with the 853 version. Okay, so just to wrap up here, let's talk about implications for CMMC. So as we talked about, this is the most insane story of all time. Back in the days of CMMC 1.0, the requirements came in two flavors. There were practices and there were processes. Practices are what you would recognize today as requirements, right? They were the things in SP 800-171. Processes were 853 controls in disguise and sort of touted as indicators of maturity. But the .999 set of processes were just policies, and those were just the -1 controls by another name with some of the words changed out of them. But they were essentially just the 853 -1 controls for each of the control families. Now, the fun part about that is that when the political backlash against CMMC 1.0 happened and DoD retreated, they aligned directly to the NIST standards and ditched all of the CMMC unique stuff that they were tailoring on top of SP 800-171. The problem with that is SP 800-171 has -1 controls listed as NFO, which means there are no requirements to have policy, even though there actually are requirements to have the policy, because you can't pass the assessment without the documentation, right? So here we are in present day, and we've got SP 800-171 revision 3, and policy and procedure -1 controls are back in the documents. The only problem is that we aren't done with CMMC rulemaking, and that's going to evaluate 171 Rev 2. So we're going to have to wait for the next round of rulemaking to update CMMC to point to 171 revision 3 to get back to evaluating the .999 maturity processes that at that time will have tried to have been implemented like 6 years beforehand. So really fun, big circle that we've done here. Yeah, really, really cool to just trace that evolution over time. By the time the second round of CMMC rulemaking is done, and we're doing Rev 3, we will officially be evaluating some of the controls that we tried to start evaluating in 2020.
It's like that, the situation, like it's like a situation where there's like theme party, right? And let's say it's a tailor party, right? It's a tailor party, and then you always have that one friend that shows up in the suit, dressed like a tailor, about to alter people's clothes. But then everybody else is like Taylor Lautner and Taylor Swift.
I don't think I've been invited to these parties.
I have never been invited to one.
Not a big party
on television. But that's how it is. And now, okay, well, let's try it again. Let's get everybody in the same costume. So then we show up. We've taken the these magical maturity controls out. And, all right, NIST, your turn. And then they show up and they're like, oh, I thought we were dressing fancy and we were altering clothes. And now, that's how it goes.
The 853 policy is the person that shows up to the party in the full tux, tails, top hat, cane, monocle, timepiece, everything. The 800-171 policy requirement is the tuxedo T-shirt of the NIST policy controls. Just save yourself the time and effort, save yourself the pain, and go with the 853 template, if you will, the outline. It's a much better. Just for instance, if you use the 171A determination statements to evaluate a purchase of policy templates, you might be getting something that is an inferior product than using the 853A version to evaluate whether your policy template is checking all of the boxes, because ultimately you're going to need that information that isn't included in 171 to verify everything else that's going on with your requirements. So just do the 53 version, take your medicine, eat your vegetables.
Riddle me this, Jacob. If I were to be an organization that had multiple, requirements from different entities that I had to fulfill, and I was writing policies, would I be better off writing my policy specific to NIST 800-171 or NIST 853 alpha?
53 alpha for sure, because
And it would make it a lot easier for me to do things like, I don't know, map the controls to where they're supposed to go.
Oh,
because
man.
there's like resources
Now
and things like that.
that's a party that I definitely get invited to. Mapping parties for sure. They get pretty out of control, let me tell you. Anyways, mapping requirements is a topic that we definitely don't have time to get into today. I hope this was helpful as a examination of what 853 policy controls look like and how they show up in requirements, and why it might be a better idea to just go with what's in 853 and 53A and save yourself the time, because the shortcuts that NIST provides to you may not necessarily be in your best interest. They may have just been an outgrowth of the revision process and keeping the document under a certain size, not actually what was relevant to having good management documented decisions in your environment.
They just can't win. Even when you tell them they do a good job, 2 weeks later, you're like,
we had a saying when I was in the Navy, sometimes your best just isn't good enough. And so, it isn't that you did a bad job. It could have been a lot better. So
once you got over the excitement and the newness of it, you're like, well, actually, this new golf club that I got doesn't hit further,
Yeah. So, like I said, the revision process to 171, even the revision process to 53, it's incremental, right? It's not going to be a big overarching overhaul where everything's going to be perfect. It's a lot better to have some requirement for policy than to have an assumption that they're being done, but they are incomplete in terms of what's required in there right now. So just look at the 53 version.
Maybe they'll add some of the ODPs back in Rev 4.
Maybe. We'll see. All right, everybody.
Your comments are going to be.
Yeah, you already know it. All right, everybody. We'll see you next week, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, see you next week.